Hello, America, and to our friends around the world, greetings and welcome back. Now that I've read to you Hung by the Tongue with a series of instructions of how one man, the author, was able to redirect his mental energy to becoming more in line, more aligned with what he felt was the moral and ethical compass that he had to be following. I included some remarks about my own experiences having read the book 30 years ago and its influence on my perception of reality and how I used it to change my own thinking and how that has benefited me. Throughout our lives, we have things that happen to us. And I can't quite remember how the saying goes, but something like there's two types of people: those that let things happen to them, or those who do something about it. I'm not certain. And if you happen to know the actual statement, please include it in the comments. It's very easy for most people to feel that they have to be a buoy in a at a harbor, weathering the storm and just lopping, left and right, to and fro, as the waves dictate. So, and that is true to a point, as nature has demonstrated that the strongest trees are the ones that can go with the wind. But also, the strongest trees have the deepest roots to keep them anchored from being blown away. This next book deals with body language, written by an FBI agent, Joe Navarro. If I remember correctly, he was a Cuban immigrant as a child, didn't speak English, and had to rely upon body language in order to to interpret other classmates, other children in the neighborhood's intentions and meaning when interacting with them. And that built a foundation for him to be able to develop it as a skill, excuse me, as a skill to be used in his work in the FBI. I don't remember exactly what it was that he did professionally for the FBI, or if he focused only on one discipline, or if he had many hats. But he's gone on to use that skill to create a series of poker tutorials, card playing tutorials to help train poker players, be able to interpret one another's tells, as well as how to minimize their tells. These books that I've read and these exercises that I've learned by attending classes, by taking these exercises that are suggested in these books and other places, I've been able to successfully do that as also. At one point, after I moved back to my house, I was employed. I had just been licensed as a private investigator, and I hadn't gotten very many clients. And the region that I lived in it wasn't a financially poor area, but it was constituted of a working class and a a welfare slash entitlement class. And there were some higher ups, but they were very few. Uh, but with those mentalities, most people were just subsisting. They had a job, they paid their bills if they had a job, and they didn't have the allowance to accommodate what they might consider a frivolous expense, even though private investigating is designed to be a beneficial, you know, it's something to put your mind at ease when you are dealing with uncertainty, whether it's performing a background check or performing a due diligence on a project. Private investigators run the gamut. There's forensics auditing. They go into accounting and they have the accounting background and they go in forensically audit bookkeeping to find out if somebody is skimming money, redirecting money into their own pocket one way or another. There are surveillance that the classic catching the cheating relationship to the individual who is vandalizing. One of the trainings I had attended, it was near the end of the day, and I was very, very tired. Myself and another investigator, we kept falling asleep during her presentation as she was describing in incredible detail, overly detailed, firewood snatching. Yes, firewood snatching. There were neighbors, and one hired her as the private investigator to document and prove that his neighbor was stealing his already chopped and stacked firewood. She was excited by the story. Unfortunately, they put her as the last speaker of the day after a very, very long day. And as I've remarked about in other online posts or in other videos, investigators, just like lawyers, are obligated, depending upon their jurisdiction, to participate in continuing education. Yeah, so if you're a licensed investigator in a certain state, sometimes you have, 20, 40, 100, depending on what the jurisdiction dictates. There's a certain amount of continuing education they expect you to participate at your own cost to have completed within a year or 2 years. And that, you know, that's how I came about that story. And I don't dismiss it because it's legitimate. Somebody wanted documented proof. Something as simple as who's stealing the newspaper that I pay for every day? Who is vandalizing? As we're seeing, and I'm recording this at the end of March, as we're seeing vandalism escalate at the Tesla dealerships around the nation, especially in the Pacific Northwest, we're finding these people vandalizing cars, attacking drivers, attacking dealerships, and a private investigator would be able to come in and look at the information and funnel it to the police to press charges. So there is a reason for doing all this stuff, but I don't want to get too deep in the weeds as to up is where I was living was it was a shift work area. It had a high level of infidelity, but these men made enough money working blue collar jobs that because it's most often men being cheated on, they just like shrugged their shoulders and said, you know what, I'll just buy another house. And that was at a time period where houses weren't $500,000 as a starter. It was more like 80,000, 70,000. Quite a jump, since the early 2000s to now. 20 years, the prices have just gone berserko. But I would go play poker, and occasionally I would win the competition. There was no buy-in, and because of following people such as Joe Navarro and developing my skills in reading body language, I was able to make my house payment and you know pay for my groceries. Wasn't a lot of money, but it was enough to make those payments, to keep the property taxes paid up, to keep the water bill paid up, to keep the garbage paid up, to keep the mortgage paid up. And in my experiences, body language is not only a great skill to hone and master for, yeah, being able to play poker, but it's also a great skill in being able to assess a situation. When you walk in to an establishment, you can you can read people. You can understand where it is that, what's going on. There was a television show about a decade ago called Leverage with Timothy Hutton, and there was a scene in it where Timothy Hutton was a corporate investigator, and he's looking at being hired by a new company. And as he's making his observation, he's observing that people that are at work aren't aren't happy. That they're apathetic about their job, that they don't like it there, and so he declined the job offer because who wants to work in a dark, apathetic environment? Because that's going to be infectious to your own mind. And it goes back to what we were reading about in Hung by the Tongue, that you have to create those boundaries to protect yourself. Otherwise, it'll infect your perception of reality. Going back to body language, though, it is a fundamental skill in being able to assess situations. When you walk into a social group, you'll be able to know whether a joke lands correctly, whether somebody's just pulling your leg, or if somebody's setting you up for a fall. There's a whole host of things, but I can also tell you that in my own experiences, there is one area that stands out where body language is very difficult, and that is interacting with people that are on drugs, hard drugs, heroin, meth, for example. And there are certain things that you have to look for when you're interacting with those people. The reason being is, for example, heroin is a muscle relaxant. It's a relaxant drug. So the facial muscles that you will learn to read with micro expressions may not be as obvious to read when somebody's using. And so it's my hope that by rereading these books, not only can I pick up notes and skills to offset that, but I can incorporate that and pass it on to you. And a lot of that reason is because even as places such as Oregon and Seattle or Washington are recognizing, oh, wait, decriminalizing these drugs maybe wasn't a good idea. You have other places such as Baltimore and Boston, if I'm not mistaken, discussing they want to follow Oregon and Washington's example. So this drug war thing doesn't seem to be going away. And my own view of it has been very libertarian at inception, and that is an adult is an adult, ergo, as an adult, their body, their choice when it comes to recreational drug use. Unfortunately, when left to one's own devices, a lot of people become very destructive, violent with the drug use. And it's because of that that I'm going back and rereading these books to find out what I've missed so that I can be able to fill in the gaps. And it's, again, as I said, I want to fill in the gaps and I want to pass that on to you because this is an issue that I don't suspect is going to disappear in the next year or two. I suspect it's going to be a decade or more, that this is going to be an environment that we need to be training ourselves on to recognize and pass along to our children. Another example about body language that I want to incorporate into this is in the Pacific Northwest, there's something called the bottle bill that was incorporated in the 70s. where you pay a deposit on each bottle and can of a drink, in particular soda pop, and it was a nickel. So if you bought a six pack of beer or soda pop, you would pay an additional 30 cents for the purchase of that item, with the promise that you return those empties to the facility that you bought it. They would return your 30 cents to you. A lot of kids would use that as a means of making money because people would throw their empties into the trash or out the window as they're driving, or whatever. And you would have bottle drives, can drives to fundraise. And now it's gone up to a dime per bottle and per can. So, what does this have to do with body language? My youngest child, because I felt it was important to instruct my children on body language, my youngest child and I, this child wanted some cash, and my instruction to my child was there's three ways of looking at life. There is one that you are a slave to the system and you get a wage slave job. You get a job, but you're never going to get rich, so to speak. You're never going to be independent doing so. You create a business and you sell something to people that they either need or want, that then you're able to keep providing to them, that keeps yourself going, and you have to keep innovating. Or there's a third way, and that is you're just complete um, dependent upon the state. And the sink or swim. Our welfare state mentality allows for a lot of people to be buoyed just by government subsistence. So, as my child was exploring these different options, we took in the the bottles and cans to a local facility, and they declined. And as we were exiting, my child turns to me and says, "She's not sorry. She's my." And I, at first, I got embarrassed and wanted to reprimand her for calling it this woman's actions out for declining the redemption. But I recognized, wait a minute, no, why would I shame my child for exhibiting exactly what I have trained my child to notice? That is, when people are lying to you, when people are trying to abuse you. And that is what I'm attempting to do here with the ellipsis behavioral table of elements dissection, with the incorporation of the video clips, or just how to do the deception rating scale, and with this book by Joe Navarro. All right, so we're 19 minutes almost into this, or over 18 minutes into this, and that is quite a bit of preface as to the motivation behind reading this. Chapter 1, Mastering the Secrets of Nonverbal Communication. This one I'll probably have to break down into parts because it's 20 pages. Mastering the Secrets of Nonverbal Communication. Whenever I'm teaching people about body language, this question is invariably asked. Joe, what got you interested in studying nonverbal behavior in the first place? It wasn't something I had planned to do, nor was it the result of some long-term fascination with the topic. It was much more down to earth than that. It was an interest born of necessity, the need to adapt successfully to a totally new way of life. When I was 8 years old, I came to America as an exile from Cuba. We left just a few months after the Bay of Pigs invasion, and we honestly thought we would be here only for a short while as refugees. Unable to speak English at first, I did what thousands of other immigrants coming to this country have done. I quickly learned that to fit in with my new classmates at school, I needed to be aware of and sensitive to the other language around me, the language of nonverbal behavior. I found that was a language I could translate and understand immediately. In my young mind, I saw the human body as a kind of billboard that transmitted, advertised, what a person was thinking via gestures, facial expressions, and physical movements that I could read. Over time, I obviously learned English and even lost some skill with the Spanish language, but the nonverbals I never forgot. I discovered at an early age that I could always rely on nonverbal communications. I learned to use body language to decipher what my classmates and teachers were trying to communicate to me and how they felt about me. One of the first things I noticed was the students or teachers who genuinely liked me would raise or arch their eyebrows when they first saw me walk into the room. On the other hand, those individuals who weren't too friendly toward me would squint their eyes slightly when I appeared, a behavior that once observed is never forgotten. I use this nonverbal information, as so many other immigrants have, quickly to evaluate and develop friendships, to communicate despite the obvious language barrier, to avoid enemies, and in nurturing healthy relationships. Many years later, I would use these same nonverbal eye behaviors to solve crimes as a special agent at the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI. Based on my background, education, and training, I want to teach you to see the world as an FBI expert on nonverbal communication views it. As a vivid, dynamic environment where every human interaction resonates with information, and as an opportunity to use the silent language of the body to enrich your knowledge of what people are thinking, feeling, and intending to do. Using this knowledge will help you stand out among others. It will also protect you and give you precise or previously hidden insight into human behavior. It will also protect you and give you previously hidden insight into human behavior. All right, now that I read it correctly. What exactly is nonverbal communication? Nonverbal communication, often referred to as nonverbal behavior or body language, is a means of transmitting information, just like the spoken word, except it is achieved through facial expressions, gestures, touching, which is haptics, physical movements, kinesics, posture, body adornment, clothes, jewelry, hairstyle, tattoos, etc. I want to interject on the behavioral table of elements. I've alluded to this on the table that there's object manipulation and such, which we haven't covered yet as of the end of March, as of exercises 1 through 18. I'm not certain when I'll get to those, but they are on the list to be covered. And even the tone, timbre, and volume of an individual's voice rather than spoken content. Nonverbal behaviors comprise approximately 60 to 65% of all interpersonal communication, and during lovemaking can constitute 100% of communication between partners. And he cites Burgoon, 1994, pages 229 through 285 for that last part. I want to go back because I had a verbal pause between touching and gestures. And it's because they had an insert box that he has listed as when he discusses his career as an FBI special agent. Box one, in the blink of an eye. And he describes eye blocking. Eye blocking is a nonverbal behavior that can occur when we feel threatened and or don't like what we see. Squinting, as in the case with my classmates described above, and closing or shielding our eyes are actions that have evolved to protect the brain from seeing undesirable images and to communicate our disdain toward others. My own interjections I want to include here is male and female dynamics. Right now, there's the we're dealing with the after effects of the fake Me Too nonsense that essentially was nothing more than a veiled effort to shame men that were perceived as obstacles to women achieving what they felt was their rightful place as executives, and that's why we're seeing game industries and movie industries and so forth tanking and losing viewership, um, because they were promoted without merit. They didn't understand their industry. And that's not just related to media, it's across the board. Upside down airplanes is another example of that. And one thing that has happened and it's been lamented in a various number of different independent video creators, and that is men have chosen to not interact with women. They have decided to limit their interactions to grocery clerks, bank tellers, and pretty much things that you cannot avoid. Um, Prior to all of this happening, there was a thing called the pickup artist community, which was maligned as being manipulative, and in some cases it probably was. But but its main focus was to help men handle social anxiety in approaching a woman, so they didn't come off as creepy, didn't come off as needy or arrogant. But one of the signs that they would teach men about is how a woman would shield herself from you if she wasn't interested. And it was, would she turn her head? If you're walking down a corridor, she's walking towards you, you're walking towards her. Does she turn her head left or right without, you know, uh, keeping it level? Is her eyesight still pretty much level, within variation? So if she's turning towards you, she's looking at you. And just as he's talking about with keeping the eyes squinted or eyebrows out arched, are you observing those things? If she's turning away from you, it's a sign of disinterest. And you can apply that to everybody. You've interacted with people whom you saw and you completely turned your head the opposite direction of where they were coming from. And if not, do this experiment. Do this experiment with yourself. Either record yourself with a video, on your phone or a video recorder, but observe yourself doing these actions both with yourself privately, and then experiment socially and see what the results are. Don't let people know so that they don't taint the experiment results, and don't do it to be cruel, but do recognize what it is that is being done or that you're doing, because you may be giving off uh, bad cues. There's a woman out of Portland, Vanessa Van Edwards or Edwards, The Science of People, and she runs a body language a training camp that talks about that, how to make yourself more approachable. And I haven't attended it. It's down the street, but the price tag is a little steep for me. But she's been on local news programs discussing that. How do people that are single make themselves approachable? How do people that are in work environments make themselves more capable of being collaborative to get things done? And that's one of the things she talks about is your eyes. Yeah, and she even admits that she has the resting bee face, and that she had to overcome that, and and that's what changed how people perceived her. So when you're interacting, do recognize that when you're walking towards somebody, do they look away from you? So if you're on their left side, do they look to their right without lowering their gaze? Now, we all know that somebody that turns their head up gives the indication of being superior or stuck up. But if they're just turning it laterally away from you, it's not so much a mark of disdain as it is a mark of uninterest. But it's not to be confused with, especially in women, when they tip their chin down towards their chest when they see you. If they tip their head down in a way, that's not the same thing as being uninterested. It's actually quite the opposite. I wanted to interject to demonstrate that because, number one, without getting into the weeds, our legal system penalizes men for being in relationships. And until that's fixed, there's no reason to be involved with them. Number two, we are in a population decline. And if we are, as a society, are to survive, we need to have that legal reformation happen that protects men's rights and not punishes them. And we need to increase offspring. And we're not going to have that if we keep avoiding each other. It is in men's best interest to avoid them because of false allegations being believed over actual evidence. But if you are so inclined to swim in shark infested waters bleeding, then I would rather you go armed so that you know when you're approaching somebody that she is or isn't interested. All right, so let's move on from that. As an investigator, I used eye blocking behaviors to assist in the arson investigation of a tragic hotel fire in Puerto Rico that claimed 97 lives. A security guard came under immediate suspicion because the blaze broke out in an area where he was assigned. One of the ways we determined he had nothing to do with starting the fire was by asking him some very specific questions as to where he was before the fire, at the time of the fire, and whether or not he set the fire. After each question, I observed his face for any telltale signs of eye block behavior. His eyes blocked only when questioned about where he was when the fire started. Oddly, in contrast, he did not seem troubled by the question, "Did you set the fire?" This told me the real issue was his location at the time of the fire, not his possible involvement in setting the fire. He was questioned further on this topic by the lead investigators and eventually admitted to leaving his post to visit his girlfriend, who also worked at the hotel. Unfortunately, while he was gone, the arsonist entered the area he should have been guarding and started the fire. In this case, the guard's eye blocking behavior gave us the insight we needed to pursue a line of questioning that eventually broke the case open. In the end, 3 arsonists responsible for the tragic blaze were arrested and convicted of the crime. The security guard, while woefully negligent and burdened with tremendous guilt, was not, however, the culprit. This is important. This is very important because as a society, as people, human beings are social creatures, and we tend to defer to one of two lines of reasoning when it's not actual reasoning, and that is we defer to whom we have subconsciously assigned the role as the alpha of the group. That's why you have a president, a mayor, a fire chief, a police chief. It's because each of those different tribes has decided that that individual is the alpha. You may disagree with, the political aspect of it, and that's your opinion. But ultimately, that's what it comes down to is why do some people get positions and others don't? It's because they exhibit leadership qualities. That's number one. Number two, women as a collective are social collaborators. What I mean by that is women as a whole would survive prior to the Industrial Revolution, specifically as an agrarian culture. Women would survive by collaborating with other women. That is, they would take what they had acquired from their husband's production. So if you're living on a farm, you're raising chickens, you're raising pigs, you're milking cows and slaughtering them when it's time for the beef, and you're growing crops. You are meeting with the other women in your localized area and you're trading what it is that has been produced, either through the woman's hands or through the man's hands, in order to survive. And that trade isn't just limited to trading beef for eggs. It's also trading textile goods, clothing, blankets, or building, creating lumber so that structures can be built, or even trading the husband's labor or the children's labor to build these homes. As a result, what happens is a social hierarchy is established that these women work collectively and they will freeze out a bad actress from that group, whom they've designated rightly or wrongly. And that isn't just limited to how women force social cohesion amongst other women, they do it to children and to men. How many of you have stood in the corner of a classroom, had your, been sent to the corner, to time out to the principal, or stood made to stand in the corner as a punitive response, especially from female teachers towards boy students? This happens quite often, and it's how they do it. They do it to shame compliance, and that is how women operate. So, what ends up happening is the stigma gets attached to the punished individual if it's a repetitive pattern. This is why boys are more harshly punished legally, is because there is that stigma that boys get in trouble more often, therefore they deserve a more harsh penalty, which is not a logical form of reasoning. Women are more adept social engineering at manipulating the situation in their favor because of this collectivist mentality, and that shaming can be done by whispers of gossip. Think of Macbeth. Macbeth became consumed by the witch's prediction that he would become king. And when the King of Scotland named his son to be the heir and not Macbeth, he became upset, and his wife began whispering in his ear as to who the true obstacle was. And it's been decades since I've read Macbeth, so I might be misremembering it. But if I'm not mistaken, you know, his wife was instrumental in the motivation for Macbeth becoming mad with power and later becoming just mad, the Mad King. But this is important stuff to keep in mind. In a, in male-dominated associations, it is routine to defer to the alpha. In female social dynamics, shaming mechanisms tend to wrongly convict somebody based off of feeling. And these things need to be checked against. That's why this insert is very valuable to incorporate. Now let's finish up with this page. Nonverbal communication can also reveal a person's true thoughts, feelings, and intentions. For this reason, nonverbal behaviors are sometimes referred to as tells, as in poker. They tell us about the person's true state of mind because the people are not always aware they are communicating nonverbally. Body language is often more honest than an individual's verbal pronouncements, which are consciously crafted to accomplish the speaker's objectives. This is box 2 insert. Actions speak louder than words. And it's an axiom. Actions speak louder than words. If you haven't heard it, an axiom is a rule of thumb. A memorable example of how body language can sometimes be more truthful than verbal language involved the rape of a young woman on the Parker Indian Reservation, Arizona. A suspect in the case was brought in for questioning. His words sounded convincing, and his story was plausible. He claimed he hadn't seen the victim, and while out in a field, had gone down a row of cotton, turned left, and then walked straight to his house. While my colleagues jotted down notes about what they were hearing, I kept my eyes on the suspect and saw that as he told the story about turning left and going home, his hand gestured to his right, which was exactly the direction that led to the rape scene. If I hadn't been watching him, I wouldn't have caught the discrepancy between his verbal, I went left, and nonverbal, hand gesturing to the right behavior. But once I saw it, I suspected he was lying. I waited a while and then confronted him again, and in the end, he confessed to the crime. This ties into what I was just discussing about 10 minutes ago about people turning their head away from you versus dipping their chin towards their chest to avert meeting your, the submission gesture. You know, these are important skills to incorporate. So do take note of it. The television show with Tim Roth, Lie to Me, demonstrated this approach, and that was the interrogator, the person, the interviewer, the individual tasked with asking the questions, to build a baseline to then elicit responses. And Tim Roth's character was most often assigned the role of observer. And as the questions were being asked, he wouldn't focus on the questions. He would focus on what the body was doing. And these interactions, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, were video recorded so that they could go back and match the body gestures with the timestamps so that he could look at it and say, okay, I saw, just as Agent Navarro discusses, about motioning with the right hand when talking about turning left. And they can say, well, this is not in alignment with the interview question. It's the opposite. And it produces a red flag. All right, we're getting into 42 minutes on here. I'm going to come back and pick up on the next page. Actually, let's finish up this topic here, and then we'll go into the next subheading. So, whenever your observation of another person's nonverbal behavior helps you understand that person's feelings, intentions, or actions, or clarifies his or her spoken words, then you have successfully decoded and used the silent medium. All right, so we're coming up at 4230. The next subheading is using nonverbal behavior to enhance your life. This is a long one, and I will not spend 18 minutes with a preface on the next. I just want to throw this in here. I don't recall if it was earlier in this video that I was going to incorporate a observation test or if it's one of the following. But if it is in one of the following, I want you to take notes of this following exercise. And when I reference it, you'll know what it's about. It's only 100 seconds long.
The monkey business illusion. Count how many times the players wearing white pass the ball. The correct answer is 16 passes. Did you spot the gorilla? For people who haven't seen or heard about a video like this before, about half missed the gorilla. If you knew about the gorilla, you probably saw it, but did you notice the curtain changing color or the player on the black team leaving the game? Let's rewind and watch it again. Here comes the gorilla, and there goes a player, and the curtain is changing from red to gold. When you're looking for a gorilla, you often miss other unexpected events. And that's the monkey business illusion. Learn more about this illusion and the original gorilla experiment at theinvisiblegorilla.com.